Welcome to a story that will take you 30,000 feet above prejudice and into the heart of a moment that redefined humanity for everyone aboard that flight. Picture this: a private jet cruising through the clouds, a symbol of wealth, exclusivity, and the barriers we construct between ourselves. But on this particular flight, those barriers would be challenged in a way no one expected. Today's story is about more than just one person or one moment. It's about a universal truth that transcends class, race, and status. It's about the strength to confront prejudice with grace and the courage to turn conflict into a call for compassion and change. Stick with us as we unravel this captivating tale of conflict, revelation, and redemption that will inspire you to rethink the way you view others and yourself. Before we begin, I invite you to pause and reflect. What can I do today to make the world a little more compassionate? Share your answer in the comments below. And if this story touches your heart, subscribe to our channel and join a community of changemakers who believe in equality and empathy. Now let's ascend together into the skies of this unforgettable journey. The hum of the jet engines filled the cabin with a soothing yet authoritative sound. This wasn't just any aircraft, it was a masterpiece of luxury, the kind reserved for CEOs, dignitaries, and individuals whose wealth allowed them to see the world from above, both literally and figuratively. Each leather seat was a throne, each glass of champagne a nod to exclusivity. Vivian Blake, the lead flight attendant, prided herself on maintaining the sanctity of this opulence. A tall, statuesque woman in her mid-50s, she was known for her precision and uncompromising standards. To Vivian, every detail mattered, from the angle of a folded napkin to the subtle perfume wafting through the cabin. But it wasn't just the material order she maintained. It was the social order as well. As the passengers boarded one by one, Vivian greeted them with a professional smile, her eyes swiftly scanning for any breach of the unspoken codes. A tech mogul, a Hollywood actress, an oil tycoon, each received her silent approval. She had done this countless times, and today was no different. Or so she thought. Then came Maya Henderson. Her presence was an immediate anomaly. Unlike the others who seemed to glide effortlessly into the jet with an air of entitlement, Maya carried herself with an understated grace. She wore a tailored navy blue dress, simple yet elegant, with a delicate gold necklace resting just above her collarbone. Her poise was undeniable, but something about her didn't fit the mold. Vivian's instincts kicked in. Years of working in such an environment had taught her to be vigilant, to notice when someone didn't belong. She greeted Maya with the same polite smile, but couldn't suppress the fleeting furrow of her brow. As Maya passed, Vivian's eyes followed her, lingering a moment too long, as if searching for a crack in the veneer. Maya settled into her seat near the window, placing a modest leather briefcase on her lap. She looked out at the tarmac, seemingly unaware of the quiet murmurs beginning to ripple through the cabin. From the corner of the aisle, Vivian watched. Something about this woman set her on edge, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the way Maya carried herself, not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that seemed almost defiant. Or perhaps it was something more subtle, something Vivian didn't want to admit even to herself. The atmosphere grew taut as the other passengers exchanged glances. Wealth and status often bred a sense of unspoken camaraderie, but Maya's presence disrupted that fragile equilibrium. Who was she? What was she doing here? And why did it matter so much? Vivian decided she needed answers. Approaching Maya with the same composed demeanor she always maintained, she leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, her tone polite but firm. "I couldn't help but notice that you're new to our flights. May I confirm your seat assignment?" Maya looked up, her expression calm but slightly puzzled. "Of course," she replied, reaching into her briefcase to retrieve a printed ticket. She handed it to Vivian without hesitation, her eyes steady and unwavering. Vivian examined the ticket, her trained eyes scanning every detail. The name matched, as did the seat number. There was no logical reason to doubt Maya's legitimacy, yet a nagging feeling persisted. "Thank you, Ms. Henderson," she said, handing back the ticket. "If you need anything during the flight, please don't hesitate to let me know." Maya nodded, her gaze lingering on Vivian for a moment. There was a depth to her eyes, a mixture of kindness and weariness that hinted at stories untold. But she said nothing, turning back to the window as if retreating into her own world. The other passengers, sensing the subtle tension, resumed their conversations, though the undercurrent of curiosity remained. Vivian returned to her post, trying to shake the unease that had settled in her chest. But the questions lingered. Who was Maya Henderson really? And why did her presence feel like a challenge to the unspoken rules of this airborne sanctuary? As the jet began its ascent, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm, golden glow. Outside, the world shrank away, leaving only clouds and the infinite expanse of the sky. For Vivian, however, the enclosed space of the cabin felt heavier than ever. She couldn't know it yet, but the flight ahead would force her to confront not just her assumptions about Maya, but the very foundations of her own beliefs. The stage was set, the characters were in place, and 30,000 feet above the ground, a story was about to unfold that would change lives forever. What unseen biases do we carry into our everyday interactions? How often do we let our assumptions guide our actions without questioning them? Stay tuned to uncover the powerful revelations that will unfold aboard this flight, a journey that will challenge perspectives and inspire change. The cabin had settled into a rhythm, the steady hum of the engines serving as a backdrop to the muted exchanges of passengers. Vivian moved through the aisles with her usual precision, refilling glasses and adjusting trays. But her mind remained restless. Something about Maya gnawed at her, an itch she couldn't scratch. It wasn't the ticket or the dress, it was the disruption. Vivian had curated a space where everyone understood their place. Yet here was someone who didn't fit the unspoken pattern. As she passed Maya's seat, Vivian slowed her steps, using the pretense of checking the overhead compartment to observe her. Maya was engrossed in a book, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of each page as she turned it. There was a calmness about her, an unshakable poise that made her presence even more pronounced. Vivian's lips tightened. She had seen many passengers over the years, but few who carried themselves with such quiet confidence, especially not newcomers to this level of exclusivity. Unable to resist, Vivian finally broke the silence. "Excuse me, Ms. Henderson," she began, her tone polite but laced with a subtle edge. "May I ask how you came to choose this airline? It's not often we have the pleasure of serving new faces." Maya looked up, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she seemed to weigh her response, as though deciding how much of herself to reveal. "I'm a frequent traveler," she said simply, "and this airline came highly recommended." Vivian nodded, though the answer did little to satisfy her curiosity. "I see," she said, her voice trailing off, but she didn't move away. "It's just that. Our clientele is typically comprised of returning members or those referred through specific channels." Maya's brow furrowed slightly. She closed her book, resting it on her lap. "I assure you, I meet all the criteria," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. "If there's an issue, perhaps it would be best to discuss it directly." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that caught Vivian off guard. The other passengers, sensing the shift in tone, began to take notice. Eyes flickered toward the exchange, their conversations pausing mid-sentence. The luxurious cabin, once filled with the soft clinking of glasses and murmured pleasantries, now seemed unnaturally still. Vivian straightened, the weight of the other passengers' gazes pressing down on her. "No issue at all, Miss Henderson," she said, forcing a smile. "I was simply ensuring that everything is in order for your comfort." But even as she spoke, the tension in her voice betrayed her unease. Maya held her gaze for a moment longer, then offered a small, measured smile. "Thank you for your concern," she said, her tone making it clear that the conversation was over. She reopened her book and resumed reading, her composure unshaken. As Vivian turned to walk away, her cheeks burned with a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. The subtle murmur of conversations resumed, but the air in the cabin felt heavier, charged with the weight of what had just transpired. Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that she had been subtly, but undeniably, put in her place. In the quiet solitude of the galley, Vivian replayed the interaction in her mind. Why had she felt the need to question Maya? What had she hoped to achieve? The questions buzzed in her head like an unrelenting swarm. And yet, deep down, she already knew the answer, an answer she wasn't ready to face. This flight, she realized, was going to be far longer than she had anticipated. What happens when assumptions are met with calm defiance? The tension aboard the flight is only beginning to build, and soon, the truth about Maya Henderson will leave everyone stunned. Stay with us as the layers of this story continue to unfold. Vivian returned to her duties, though her movements had lost their usual precision. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured champagne, her thoughts swirling around Maya's composed response. Why had the woman's calm demeanor unsettled her so deeply? The other passengers, sensing the shift in Vivian's mood, avoided her gaze, opting instead to whisper quietly among themselves. The undercurrent of curiosity was palpable, and all of it pointed to one person. Maya, meanwhile, seemed unbothered by the unspoken scrutiny. She continued to read her book, the faintest hint of a smile playing on her lips, as though she were aware of the growing tension, but refused to be consumed by it. Her calmness only fueled the quiet storm in Vivian's mind. Was it arrogance, defiance, or was it something else entirely, something Vivian couldn't name? As Vivian prepared to serve the next round of refreshments, a sudden thought struck her. Maya's reaction had not been one of anger or indignation, but of quiet strength. That strength unnerved her. Over the years, Vivian had seen people respond to subtle challenges in various ways: anger, submission, discomfort. But Maya had chosen none of those paths. Instead, she had met Vivian's assumptions with grace and an unspoken confidence that seemed unshakable. When Vivian approached Maya again, it was under the guise of professionalism, though her true intent was far more personal. "Ms. Henderson," she began, her voice measured but tinged with something approaching vulnerability. "I wanted to apologize if I came across as intrusive earlier. It's my job to ensure everything runs smoothly, and sometimes She trailed off, searching for the right words. "Sometimes I overstep." Maya looked up from her book, her expression softening slightly. "I understand," she said, her voice warm but direct. "I imagine your job requires you to anticipate problems before they arise. But I assure you, I'm not one of them." The words were spoken gently, without malice, yet they struck Vivian like a blow. For a moment, she felt exposed, as though Maya had seen through the carefully constructed facade she wore. "Of course not," Vivian said quickly, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't mean to suggest." "It's all right," Maya interrupted, her tone reassuring. "We all carry biases, even if we don't realize it. What matters is how we choose to respond to them." Vivian blinked, unsure how to reply. Maya's words lingered in the air, carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. She nodded awkwardly and stepped away, her mind spinning. How often had she acted on her assumptions without questioning them? How many times had she allowed her judgments to shape her interactions? The questions were uncomfortable, but they refused to be silenced. As the flight continued, Maya's quiet confidence began to affect not just Vivian, but the other passengers as well. One by one, they found themselves drawn to her, not out of curiosity, but out of a growing respect. A businessman seated nearby struck up a conversation, asking about the book she was reading. A woman in the aisle seat complimented her necklace, and Maya responded with genuine warmth, sharing the story of how it had been a gift from her late grandmother. Through these small exchanges, a different picture of Maya began to emerge. She was not the outsider they had assumed her to be, but a woman of substance and depth, with a story that resonated on a deeply human level. Yet even as the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift, Vivian found herself grappling with an uncomfortable truth. Maya's composure and kindness were a mirror, reflecting back the insecurities and biases Vivian had long tried to hide. The seeds of change have been planted, but will they take root? As Maya's presence begins to challenge long-held assumptions, the tension aboard the flight continues to build. What lies beneath her calm exterior? And how will her true identity reshape the narrative? Stay tuned as the revelations unfold. As the flight progressed, the undercurrent of tension began to shift into something more complex. Passengers, previously content in their comfortable bubbles, now found themselves quietly observing the interactions around them. One man in particular, seated in the corner with a leather-bound notebook resting on his lap, had been paying closer attention than most. His name was Henry Graves, a seasoned journalist whose sharp eyes missed nothing. For Henry, the subtle interplay between Maya and Vivian was more than a fleeting cabin drama. It was a microcosm of the broader struggles he had spent decades documenting. Henry adjusted his glasses, leaning slightly forward as he watched Vivian pass Maya's seat yet again, her movements less confident than before. There was a story here, he was certain of it. But unlike the others who seemed content to speculate in hushed tones, Henry felt compelled to act. He knew better than anyone the power of a single moment to spark change. And this flight, he sensed, might hold such a moment. Taking his chance during a lull in activity, Henry approached Maya with a friendly but deliberate air. "Excuse me," he began, his voice low and inviting. "I couldn't help but notice the book you're reading. James Baldwin, isn't it?" Maya looked up, her face lighting with a small smile. "It is," she replied. "One of my favorites." Henry nodded, pulling out the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. "A bold choice for a flight like this," he remarked, his tone tinged with knowing humor. "Baldwin's words have a way of peeling back the layers we'd rather keep hidden." Maya chuckled softly, closing the book and resting it on the table. "I suppose they do," she said, "but perhaps that's exactly what's needed." The exchange, though brief, was enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Henry's reputation preceded him. Many recognized him as the author of hard-hitting exposes on social inequality and human resilience. His presence seemed to validate Maya in a way that no luxury ticket or elegant attire ever could. The murmurs grew quieter, replaced by a sense of collective curiosity. Who was this woman who so easily commanded the respect of someone like Henry Graves? As their conversation continued, Henry skillfully guided it toward the events earlier in the flight. "I couldn't help but notice the interaction between you and the flight attendant," he said, his tone casual but pointed. "It reminded me of situations I've written about, situations where appearances carry more weight than they should." Maya met his gaze, her expression calm but serious. "It's not the first time I've faced assumptions," she admitted, "and I doubt it will be the last. But I've learned that reacting with anger only reinforces the walls people put up. Sometimes the best way to challenge prejudice is by showing them the truth calmly, but undeniably." Henry nodded thoughtfully, scribbling something in his notebook. "And what is the truth, Ms. Henderson?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Who are you really?" Maya hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "I'm someone who believes in the power of grace," she said finally. "But I also believe in accountability. The two aren't mutually exclusive." Henry's pen paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered her words. Before he could press further, a voice interrupted them. "Mr. Graves?" It was Vivian. She stood a few feet away, her posture rigid but her voice tentative. "I noticed you haven't had a chance to try our signature champagne. May I bring you a glass?" Henry glanced at Maya, a silent question passing between them. Then he turned back to Vivian with a polite smile. "That won't be necessary," he said. "But thank you." Vivian lingered for a moment, her eyes darting between the two of them. There was an uncertainty in her gaze now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. It was clear that she, too, was beginning to question her assumptions, though she didn't yet know how to reconcile them. As Vivian walked away, Henry leaned closer to Maya, lowering his voice. "She's wrestling with something," he said. "You've planted a seed, whether you intended to or not." Maya smiled faintly, her eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, the vast expanse of clouds stretched endlessly, a reminder of the distance between where they were and the ground below. "Sometimes a seed is all it takes," she said quietly. "The conversations aboard the flight are starting to unravel deeper truths. But what will happen when Maya's identity is fully revealed? The answers lie ahead, and they will change everything for everyone on board. Stay tuned as the stakes rise and the truth comes to light." The cabin buzzed with subdued energy, the kind that arises when anticipation hangs in the air like a coiled spring. Passengers glanced at Maya with a mix of curiosity and respect, their earlier assumptions quietly unraveling. Henry had returned to his seat, but his conversation with Maya had sparked a ripple effect. Whispers passed between passengers as speculation grew about the quiet woman who seemed to exude an unshakable calm. Through it all, Maya remained composed, as though she had spent a lifetime navigating these undercurrents. Vivian, however, found no such ease. Every time she crossed the cabin, her gaze involuntarily drifted to Maya. Each glance carried the weight of her inner conflict, a tug of war between her ingrained biases and the growing realization that she might have been wrong. But what unsettled her most was not the possibility of her own error. It was the grace with which Maya had responded. It was a mirror Vivian wasn't ready to look into. When Vivian finally approached Maya again, it wasn't under the guise of professionalism, but out of a compulsion she couldn't suppress. Her steps were hesitant, her usual air of authority softened by something closer to humility. "Miss Henderson," she began, her voice quieter than before. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I was wondering if you'd like to share a bit about yourself. It's rare to see someone as poised as you in moments like these." Maya looked up, her expression thoughtful. For a moment, she said nothing, as though deciding whether to indulge Vivian's request. Finally, she placed her book aside and folded her hands in her lap. "I suppose that's fair," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it, as though every word carried years of untold stories. "I'm Maya Henderson," she began, her tone even but unyielding. "I'm the CEO of Crescent Horizons, a global logistics company. We're one of the primary investors in this airline, actually." The cabin seemed to hold its breath as her words settled over the room like a blanket of shock. Maya's revelation was simple yet seismic, a quiet truth that turned the dynamics of the flight on their head. Vivian's lips parted slightly, her professional composure cracking under the weight of her surprise. "You're the CEO?" Vivian asked, her voice faltering. She searched Maya's face for any hint of jest, but there was none. The passengers around them exchanged stunned glances, the murmurs growing louder now. Some leaned forward in their seats, as though to confirm what they had just heard. "Yes," Maya continued, her tone unwavering. "I've worked my way up in an industry where I wasn't expected to succeed. I've faced more closed doors than I can count. But I've learned that how we respond to those doors matters as much as the effort it takes to open them. This flight isn't just a journey for me, it's a reminder of what we still need to overcome." The weight of her words pressed into the room, silencing even the most skeptical of minds. Vivian's face flushed, her earlier assumptions crashing down around her. "I had no idea," she stammered. I'm so sorry if I..." Maya raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Apologies aren't what I'm looking for," she said gently. "What I hope for is reflection. It's easy to make assumptions, especially in environments like this, but those assumptions have consequences, even when they're unspoken." The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, many realizing that Maya's words applied not just to Vivian, but to them as well. The silence in the cabin was thick with self-awareness, a collective reckoning that few had anticipated when they boarded the jet. Vivian, meanwhile, felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. Her chest tightened with a mix of regret and shame. "You're right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. That was wrong of me." Maya's expression softened, though her calm remained unbroken. "Acknowledging it is the first step," she said. "We all have blind spots. The question is whether we're willing to confront them." The conversation hung in the air like an unanswered prayer, each passenger silently grappling with their own realizations. Vivian, for her part, felt an unfamiliar vulnerability creeping in. She had spent years perfecting her role, maintaining control over every detail of her professional life. But here, in the presence of Maya's quiet strength, she felt exposed. And yet, in that exposure, she sensed the faintest glimmer of growth. Maya's identity has turned the narrative upside down, but her revelations are far from over. As the flight continues, She will use this moment to challenge not just Vivian, but everyone aboard to confront their biases and embrace a deeper understanding of empathy and equality. Stay with us as the story reaches new heights of transformation. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted entirely. What had begun as quiet whispers of judgment had transformed into a hum of introspection and unspoken guilt. Maya's words echoed in the minds of every passenger, her calm yet firm demeanor leaving an indelible impression. Vivian stood near the galley, her hands clutching the counter as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Her thoughts spiraled. How had she allowed herself to fall into such assumptions? She had always prided herself on her professionalism, but now that pride felt hollow. Maya, meanwhile, sat quietly in her seat, gazing out the window. The clouds below looked like an endless sea, vast and unbroken. Yet within her, a storm brewed. Despite her outward calm, moments like this carried a weight she rarely let others see. For Maya, every encounter with prejudice brought back memories of the countless barriers she had faced throughout her life. The boardrooms where her competence was questioned, the polite but pointed questions about her qualifications, the constant need to prove that she belonged in spaces where she was often treated as an anomaly. As the flight attendants prepared to serve the next meal, a man in a navy blazer leaned across the aisle toward Maya. "Ms. Henderson," he said, his voice tinged with regret, "I'd like to apologize for my earlier assumptions. I realize now that I judged you unfairly, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." Maya turned toward him, offering a small, understanding smile. "Thank you," she replied. "Acknowledging our biases is never easy, but it's an important step. We're all capable of growing if we're willing to learn." Her words carried no trace of bitterness, only a quiet resolve. The man nodded, visibly moved, and leaned back into his seat. Across the cabin, other passengers exchanged glances, their own silent acknowledgments of guilt and reflection. It wasn't often that they were confronted with their own biases, and the experience was as humbling as it was transformative. Vivian, however, remained rooted in place. The words she wanted to say churned inside her, but they refused to form. How could she apologize for something so deeply ingrained? Something she hadn't even realized she carried until it was laid bare? The thought of facing Maya again filled her with a mix of fear and shame, but also a strange sense of hope. Perhaps this moment, painful as it was, could be the start of something new. Finally, Vivian took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle. Her legs felt unsteady, as though the plane itself had tilted beneath her. She approached Maya slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Ms. Henderson," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Maya turned her head, her expression neutral but attentive. "Of course," she said, setting her book aside. Vivian hesitated, her carefully rehearsed words scattering like leaves in the wind. I want to say I'm sorry," she said finally. "Not just for how I treated you earlier, but for the assumptions I made before I even spoke to you. I realize now how unfair that was. You've shown nothing but grace and patience, and I didn't deserve that kindness." Maya studied her for a moment, her gaze softening. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong, especially when it comes to confronting our own biases." Vivian nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. "I've been doing this job for so many years," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I knew people. I thought I was good at reading them. But I see now that I've let my assumptions cloud my judgment." Maya's expression remained calm, but there was a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "We all carry biases, Vivian," she said gently. "The question is what we do when we recognize them. It's not about being perfect, it's about being willing to grow." The words hit Vivian like a wave, washing over her with both clarity and relief. For the first time in years, she felt a crack in the walls she had built around herself. She nodded, blinking back tears, and took a step back. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for your patience and your example." As Vivian returned to her station, a strange calm settled over her. She knew she still had much to learn, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope that change was possible. Maya watched her go, a faint smile playing on her lips. She knew this moment was just one of many in her journey, but each one mattered. Each one was a step toward a better world. The flight is far from over, and Maya's actions are sparking a ripple effect throughout the cabin. But what happens when this moment reaches beyond the confines of the plane? In the next chapter, the story takes a turn that will reverberate far beyond the skies. Stay with us to see how one act of grace can transform lives. The rest of the flight settled into an unusual quiet, a reflection of the introspection that had swept through the cabin. Conversations became softer, more thoughtful. Passengers who had once shielded themselves with airs of superiority now seemed humbled, their eyes occasionally drifting toward Maya with a mixture of admiration and lingering guilt. For Henry Graves, however, the story unfolding before him demanded more than silent observation. He had spent years chronicling moments like this, moments when an individual's grace could challenge an entire room's prejudices. And he wasn't about to let it end at 30,000 feet. Henry discreetly reviewed the notes he had been jotting in his leather notebook. The essence of the story was clear, a powerful yet understated challenge to societal norms, embodied in the composed demeanor of one extraordinary woman. But as a seasoned journalist, he knew that words alone wouldn't suffice. People needed to see Maya's strength, hear her voice, and witness the transformation she had inspired aboard the flight. With that thought, Henry carefully adjusted his phone's position, its camera already capturing the interaction between Vivian and Maya earlier. What had begun as a passive observation was now evidence of a moment he believed could inspire change far beyond this cabin. The flight neared its destination, but for Maya, the journey was far from over. She could feel the weight of the eyes upon her passengers who had once dismissed her, were now looking to her as a source of quiet leadership. As they descended, the golden glow of the setting sun filled the cabin, casting long shadows that felt almost symbolic. Maya remained seated, her hands folded in her lap as the seatbelt sign flickered on. She caught Henry's gaze from across the aisle, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was an unspoken understanding between them. What had happened here would not stay confined to this flight. When the wheels finally touched down, the passengers prepared to disembark, but the usual rush for the exit was absent. Instead, people lingered, their movements slower, as though reluctant to leave the space where transformation had quietly unfolded. Maya gathered her belongings with her usual composure, but as she moved toward the aisle, a man stepped forward. "Ms. Henderson," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you. You've reminded us of something we'd all forgotten, that decency and respect shouldn't be tied to appearances. I won't forget this." Maya nodded, offering him a warm but humble smile. "Neither should I," she replied. "Thank you for your kindness." The simple exchange was the first of many. Several passengers took the opportunity to approach Maya, offering quiet apologies or words of gratitude. Even Vivian, who now stood by the exit with her usual professional posture, met Maya's gaze with a soft, genuine smile. "Safe travels, Ms. Henderson," she said. The words carried more weight than the usual pleasantries, and Maya acknowledged them with a subtle nod. As the passengers dispersed into the terminal, Henry made his way to a quiet corner, already reviewing the footage he had captured. The interaction between Maya and Vivian stood out in particular. Vivian's hesitance, Maya's grace, and the subtle shift in the atmosphere of the cabin. It was powerful, raw, and undeniably real. Henry hesitated for a moment, considering the ethical implications of sharing such a personal moment. But then he thought of the larger message it carried, a story that could ripple far beyond these walls, challenging others to confront their own biases and assumptions. Within hours, the footage was online, accompanied by a thoughtful article penned by Henry. His words painted a vivid picture of the flight, a microcosm of society's struggles with prejudice and a testament to the transformative power of grace. The video quickly gained traction, shared by prominent figures and organizations advocating for equality. Comments flooded in from people around the world, sharing their own stories of bias and growth, inspired by Maya's quiet strength. For Maya, the days following the flight were a whirlwind of attention. Media outlets reached out, eager to amplify her story, while social media buzzed with conversations sparked by the video. Yet, through it all, Maya remained true to herself, using the platform not to center attention on her own experiences, but to advocate for broader societal change. "This isn't just about one flight," she said in an interview. "It's about the countless moments of prejudice and grace that happen every day, often unseen. If this story inspires even one person to confront their biases, then it's worth sharing." But not everyone was ready to embrace the message. The video also sparked backlash from those who felt uncomfortable confronting their own complicity in systemic prejudice. Some dismissed the story as exaggerated or irrelevant, while others criticized Henry for filming without explicit consent. Yet, even the criticism served to highlight the broader conversation Maya had ignited. Conversation about the invisible walls we build and the courage it takes to tear them down. Maya's story has gone viral, sparking global discussions about prejudice and equality. But how will she navigate the attention? And what lessons will the world take from her journey? In the next chapter, the ripple effects of this moment will challenge even Maya's resolve as she steps into the spotlight. Stay tuned as the story unfolds further, revealing the deeper impact of grace under pressure. The story of the flight had taken on a life of its own. Within days, it became a global phenomenon, with hashtags, news segments, and countless opinion pieces, dissecting every aspect of what had occurred 30,000 feet above the ground. Yet for Maya, the attention was secondary to the message. She had no desire to be a symbol of virtue, but hoped her experience might spark meaningful reflection in those who encountered it. Amid the whirlwind of interviews and invitations, a quiet email arrived in her inbox that caught her off guard. A message from Vivian. Vivian had spent the days since the flight in deep turmoil. The video had exposed her moment of weakness to the world, and though Maya had handled the situation with grace, Vivian was left to grapple with the stark reality of her actions. The media painted her as the antagonist of the story, a symbol of the very biases society needed to dismantle. But beneath the headlines, Vivian was a woman filled with regret, desperate to make amends. The email was short but heartfelt. "Ms. Henderson, I don't expect forgiveness, but I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. I need to apologize, not just for what I said, but for what it revealed about me. If you're willing, I'd like to meet in person." Maya stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. She agreed to meet Vivian, not out of anger or pity, but because she understood the importance of such moments. Change, she believed, often started with discomfort, and if Vivian was willing to face hers, Maya would not turn her away. A week later, they met in a small cafe tucked away from the bustling city streets. Vivian arrived early, her posture stiff and her hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. When Maya entered, Vivian stood awkwardly, unsure whether to extend her hand or offer an apology outright. Maya's calm presence, however, immediately eased the tension. "Thank you for meeting me," Vivian said, her voice soft and trembling. Maya nodded as she took her seat. "I appreciate you reaching out," she replied. "It's not always easy to confront these things." Vivian exhaled shakily, her carefully composed demeanor cracking as emotion seeped into her voice. "I've spent my whole life believing I was fair, that I treated everyone equally," she began. "But what happened on that flight? It forced me to see things I didn't want to admit about myself. I judged you before I even spoke to you, and I can't take that back. But I'm truly deeply sorry." Maya listened intently, her expression steady. She didn't interrupt, allowing Vivian to speak freely. "The truth is," Vivian continued, her voice breaking, "I've been blind to my own biases for so long. You didn't just challenge me, you opened my eyes. And for that, I'm grateful, even if it's been uncomfortable." For a moment, silence hung between them. Maya could see the sincerity in Vivian's eyes, the vulnerability of a woman laying bare her flaws in the hope of redemption. "Thank you for your honesty," Maya said at last. "It takes courage to face these things head on, and I respect that. None of us are immune to biases. It's part of being human. What matters is what we do once we recognize them." Vivian nodded, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since Maya had arrived. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I hope to do better. I've already enrolled in diversity and inclusion training, and I'm rethinking how I approach my work. I want to ensure no one else feels the way I made you feel." Maya smiled faintly, the corners of her lips softening in a way that spoke of hope rather than judgment. "Forgiveness isn't mine alone to give," she said gently. "It's something you'll find within yourself as you continue to grow. What's important is that you're taking the steps to change, and that's a start." Their conversation continued, moving beyond the events of the flight to broader topics: systemic inequality, the subtle ways biases manifest, and the steps both individuals and institutions could take to foster empathy and understanding. By the end of their meeting, Vivian felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally been lifted. As they parted ways, Vivian extended her hand. This time, it was Maya who initiated the handshake, gripping Vivian's hand firmly but warmly. "Thank you for reaching out," Maya said. "I wish you well on this journey." Vivian watched as Maya walked away, her figure disappearing into the busy street. For the first time in days, Vivian felt a sense of clarity. She couldn't erase the past, but she could shape her future and perhaps inspire others to do the same. The conversation between Maya and Vivian marks a turning point, but the ripple effects of the flight are far from over. As Maya steps into her role as a global advocate for equality, she faces new challenges and unexpected allies. Stay with us as the story unfolds further, exploring the power of reconciliation and the road to meaningful change. The weeks following Maya and Vivian's meeting marked the beginning of something much larger than either of them had anticipated. What started as an isolated incident aboard a private jet became a catalyst for conversations that rippled far beyond the confines of the airline industry. Maya, ever the strategist, understood the importance of momentum. The attention her story had garnered wasn't just an opportunity, it was a responsibility. If she was going to step into the spotlight, it had to be for a purpose greater than herself. With the support of her team at Crescent Horizons, Maya launched an initiative called Elevate Together, a global campaign aimed at addressing unconscious bias and promoting equity in professional and social spaces. The movement was built on two pillars: education and action. Workshops, webinars, and resources were designed to teach individuals and organizations how to identify and dismantle biases within their systems. But Elevate Together wasn't just about corporate programs. It also encouraged personal reflection, creating safe spaces for people to share their stories and learn from one another's experiences. Maya knew the power of storytelling and used her own journey as an example. But she made it clear that this wasn't just about her. She highlighted voices from all walks of life: teachers, nurses, factory workers, and people who had faced prejudice in ways both subtle and overt. Their stories painted a picture of a world still grappling with deeply ingrained biases, but also brimming with the potential for change. These narratives were shared across social media, in community centers, and even in classrooms, sparking discussions that were raw, emotional, and long overdue. One of the first major victories for Elevate Together came when Maya partnered with the airline where the incident had occurred. Under her guidance, they implemented a series of reforms, including mandatory unconscious bias training for all employees, a diverse hiring initiative, and the creation of an internal equity task force. These changes were not mere gestures. They were structural shifts that challenged the very foundation of the company's culture. To Maya's surprise, Vivian became one of the task force's most active members. Her newfound passion for fostering inclusion resonated deeply with employees, who saw her transformation as proof that change was possible. The movement also attracted attention from global leaders and influencers, many of whom reached out to Maya to offer their support. Among them was Henry Graves, the journalist whose video had brought the story to the world's attention. He asked Maya for an exclusive interview to discuss the progress of Elevate Together. The resulting piece, published in a leading international magazine, was titled "Beyond the Skies: One Woman's Fight for Equity in Every Space." In it, Maya spoke candidly about the challenges of leading such a movement, her moments of doubt, and the unwavering belief that even small acts of courage could ignite widespread change. Despite the overwhelming positivity surrounding Elevate Together, the journey was not without its setbacks. Critics accused Maya of using the incident to gain publicity, while others dismissed the movement as performative or too idealistic. Maya met these criticisms head-on, her calm resolve unshaken. "Change is never comfortable," she said during a live panel discussion. "It challenges our assumptions, disrupts our routines, and forces us to confront parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. But discomfort is necessary. It's the birthplace of growth." The movement also revealed unexpected allies. Vivian, for instance, became one of Maya's strongest advocates, often speaking at Elevate Together events about her own journey of self-awareness. She was honest about her initial resistance to change and the shame she had felt after the flight, but she framed these struggles as essential parts of the process. "I'm proof that it's never too late to unlearn," she told an audience at a leadership summit. "The first step is admitting you don't have all the answers. The second is being willing to listen." As Elevate Together grew, its impact began to manifest in tangible ways. Businesses reported improved employee morale and collaboration after implementing the campaign's practices. Schools that adopted the program saw students engaging in deeper conversations about inclusion and respect. Maya often received letters and emails from people around the world, sharing how the movement had changed their perspectives or inspired them to take action in their communities. Each message reaffirmed her belief that while systemic change was vital, the most profound transformations often started on a personal level. But for Maya, the most significant moment came during a quiet visit to a local community center that adopted Elevate Together's principles. She sat in a circle of teenagers, their faces alight with curiosity as they shared their experiences of encountering and challenging prejudice. One boy, no older than 16, raised his hand hesitantly. "Ms. Henderson," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "how do you stay so calm when people don't believe you belong somewhere?" Maya looked at him, her heart swelling with both pride and sadness. "I remind myself that my worth isn't defined by their doubts," she said softly. "And I stay calm because reacting with anger often builds more walls. But that doesn't mean staying silent. Grace and strength go hand in hand. Use your voice, even when it shakes. That's how we create change." The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful, and Maya knew in that moment that the seeds of something powerful had been planted. As she left the center that evening, she reflected on how far the journey had taken her and how much further there was to go. Maya's movement is gaining momentum, but with growth comes new challenges. As Elevate Together begins to reshape the landscape, how will Maya navigate the pressures of leading a global initiative? And what happens when the movement uncovers truths that some would rather keep hidden? Stay tuned as the story takes an unexpected turn, pushing Maya and her allies to their limits. As Elevate Together expanded its reach, Maya found herself navigating uncharted territory. The movement had grown beyond her initial vision, with partnerships spanning industries, schools, and grassroots organizations. The public began to see Elevate Together not just as an initiative, but as a cultural shift, a call to action that demanded introspection and systemic change. But with that growth came immense pressure. Every new decision carried weight, every public appearance was scrutinized, and every partnership risked criticism if it fell short of the ideals the movement embodied. Maya thrived in high-stakes environments, but even she couldn't deny the toll it was taking on her. The pressure culminated in a pivotal moment when a high-profile sponsor, a multinational corporation, offered significant funding to Elevate Together. On paper, the offer seemed like an obvious win. The resources could expand the program's reach tenfold, funding workshops and advocacy efforts in underserved regions. But a closer examination of the company's practices revealed a troubling history of discriminatory policies and mistreatment of workers. Maya faced a dilemma: accept the funding and risk compromising the movement's integrity, or decline and lose a chance to accelerate change. Seeking clarity, Maya turned to her closest advisors, including Vivian, who had become a trusted confidant. Vivian spoke candidly, drawing from her own experiences. "You've taught me that actions matter more than appearances," she said. "If we align with them without accountability, we risk sending the wrong message. But if we push for change within their walls first, maybe they'll become part of the solution instead of the problem." The idea resonated with Maya, and after intense negotiations, the company agreed to overhaul its internal practices before formalizing the partnership. The decision was met with mixed reactions, but Maya stood firm, knowing that true progress often required taking the harder road. Meanwhile, Vivian's journey of redemption continued to unfold in meaningful ways. Inspired by her work with Elevate Together, she took on the role of Diversity and Inclusion Officer within the airline. She overhauled hiring practices, advocated for mentorship programs, and instituted policies that ensured every employee felt valued and heard. Her transformation became a cornerstone of the movement's message that change was possible for anyone willing to confront their biases and commit to growth. The public response to Vivian's efforts was overwhelmingly positive. Employees who had once felt invisible now found a champion in her, and passengers began noticing subtle but significant changes in how they were treated. Vivian often credited Maya as her inspiration, but she also recognized that the real work had come from within. "Maya showed me the way," she said in an interview, "but I had to take the steps myself. That's the lesson I want others to learn. The path to change is personal, but its impact is collective." As the first anniversary of Elevate Together approached, Maya and her team organized a global summit to celebrate the progress they had achieved and to chart the path forward. The event brought together people from all walks of life: leaders, activists, students, and everyday individuals who had been touched by the movement. The highlight of the summit was a panel discussion featuring Vivian and other individuals whose lives had been transformed by Elevate Together. Their stories were raw and inspiring, showcasing the ripple effects of one flight, one moment, and one act of grace. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she stood before the crowd with a quiet confidence that had become her hallmark. "Change begins in the smallest moments," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It begins when we choose to see beyond appearances, when we listen instead of judge, and when we challenge the systems that keep us divided." This movement isn't about me or any one person. It's about all of us, about what we can achieve when we come together to elevate not just ourselves, but each other. Her words were met with a standing ovation, the room filled with the kind of energy that comes from collective hope. As Maya stepped down from the stage, she caught Vivian's eye in the audience. The two women exchanged a look that spoke volumes, a shared understanding of the journey they had traveled and the work that still lay ahead. In the weeks following the summit, Elevate Together continued to grow, inspiring new initiatives and sparking conversations in communities around the world. Maya remained at its helm, not as a figurehead, but as a facilitator of change, constantly reminding others that the power to transform society rested in their hands. Vivian, too, carried the movement's principles into every aspect of her work, becoming a beacon of redemption and resilience. Though their paths had begun on opposite sides of a confrontation, Maya and Vivian's lives were now irrevocably intertwined. Together, they had proven that even the smallest acts of courage and compassion could create waves of change. The flight that had brought them together had been more than a journey through the skies. It had been a journey into the depths of human potential. The story of Elevate Together doesn't end here. As the movement continues to inspire others, what role will you play in challenging prejudice and fostering inclusion? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to join a community dedicated to making the world a better place. The journey is far from over. Together, we can continue to rise. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of transformation and hope. Stories like this remind us of the power of compassion, courage, and the determination to challenge the norms that divide us. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. What small act of kindness or understanding can you commit to today? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share an inspiring message, such as, "I believe in a world where empathy leads to action." And let's fill this space with positivity and purpose. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll become part of a community that believes in the power of storytelling to inspire change. And there's so much more waiting for you. Check out our other videos for more moving stories of resilience, hope, and transformation. Let's keep the conversation going and continue to rise together. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.